It's April 23rd, 1935, and you're standing inside a Moscow mansion where birch trees are blooming indoors. Hundreds of birds are flying through the ballroom, and someone has just handed a bear a glass of champagne. Inside these walls, music, flowers, and one of the most extravagant parties Moscow had ever seen. Outside, Stalin's Soviet Union, a world of censorship, surveillance, and growing political fear. So how does a night like this happen in a place like that? To understand why that night even existed, you need to understand the man who built it. William Bullitt wasn't a typical diplomat. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately started rearranging the furniture, metaphorically speaking, and, as it turned out, literally. In 1933, after 16 years of complete diplomatic silence, the United States finally restored relations with the Soviet Union. No American ambassador had set foot in Moscow since the revolution. Bullitt changed that. He became the first official U.S. ambassador to the USSR, arriving in a city that had very little interest in making foreign diplomats feel welcome. Moscow in the mid-1930s was not a glamorous posting. Foreign diplomats who served there described the atmosphere as controlled, joyless, and quietly oppressive. The social calendar was sparse. The mood was tense. It was, by most accounts, exactly the kind of city that makes you want to do something completely unhinged just to feel something. Bullitt felt something, all right. His idea for the Spring Festival wasn't, let's have a nice dinner. His idea was closer to, what if we built an entirely different reality inside this mansion and invited everyone who mattered in Moscow to step into it? So that's what he did. The preparations alone were extraordinary. Staff forced birch trees to bloom weeks ahead of schedule so they'd be in full flower on the night. Tulips were shipped in from Finland because apparently Soviet florists weren't going to cut it. Theatrical lighting transformed the rooms. And then, because none of that was apparently enough, Bullitt decided the event needed live animals. You know what this diplomatic reception needs? A bear. Not a metaphorical bear. Not a bear-shaped centerpiece. An actual young bear sourced alongside birds, pheasants, parakeets, zebra finches, goats, and roosters. Many of them pulled directly from the Moscow Zoo. A purpose-built aviary was constructed inside the mansion to house hundreds of birds. Hundreds. In one building. For a party. If you've ever had a single pigeon get into your house and completely lose your mind about it, try to picture what several hundred birds loose in a ballroom actually looks like. It's not ambiance. It's a wildlife incident. And that's more or less what happened. During the night, birds escaped the aviary and began flying through the rooms, through the music, through the dancing, through the champagne glasses. The evening had officially crossed from diplomatic reception into something that doesn't have a clean category. And the bear? A guest gave it champagne. Of course they did. On the night of April 23rd, somewhere between 400 and 500 guests arrived at Spaso House. This wasn't a gathering of minor functionaries. The guest list represented the highest levels of Soviet society. Diplomats, military commanders, government officials, writers, artists, cultural figures. The people in that room were, by every measure available in 1935, untouchable, powerful, celebrated. The kind of people who don't worry about what tomorrow looks like because tomorrow has always been fine. They walked into a mansion that looked nothing like the Soviet Union. Indoors, forests in full bloom, flowers everywhere, music, dancing, champagne flowing freely enough that someone thought offering some to a bear was a reasonable decision. For one night inside those walls, Moscow felt like a different world entirely. But here's the thing about walls. They don't actually change what's on the other side of them. And what was on the other side of those embassy walls in April 1935 was a very different story. To understand why this night was so extraordinary and so deeply strange in hindsight, you need to step outside the mansion and look at the country these guests were about to go home to. If Bullitt had stopped at the flowers and the birch trees, that party would still be legendary. But he added a bear. Would you have given it the champagne? Or was that one guest completely out of line? Drop your answer in the comments below. Now let's step outside those embassy walls and look at the world the guests were about to walk back into. But step outside those embassy walls for a moment, because that's exactly where this night gets genuinely hard to sit with. The Moscow that Bullitt's guests were about to walk back into was not the Moscow inside that ballroom. By 1935, the Soviet Union had already lived through years of forced collectivization, a campaign so brutal that the famine it triggered in the early 1930s killed millions of people. Not thousands, millions. Citizens who survived it did so in a country where what you said, who you knew, and who knew you could determine whether you kept your job, your apartment, or your freedom. Censorship wasn't a policy debate. It was the air. You didn't read what you wanted. You read what you were permitted to read, and you understood, without anyone having to explain it, that the distinction mattered enormously. Then, in December 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated. Kirov was one of the most prominent figures in the Soviet leadership, and his death gave Stalin exactly the kind of political opening that men like Stalin are very good at using. The investigation that followed became a pretext for arrests. The arrests became a wave, and that wave, by April 1935, was already building, not yet the full force of the Great Terror, which would peak in 1937 and 1938, but unmistakably moving in that direction. People in Moscow in the spring of 1935 could feel the temperature dropping. They just couldn't say so out loud. So picture what it actually meant to attend that party. You are a Soviet official, a military commander, a celebrated writer. You walk into Spaso House and the world inside is flowers and birch trees and champagne and birds flying through the chandeliers. You stay for hours. You dance. You drink. Someone offers a bear a glass of champagne and you watch it happen and maybe you laugh. And then the night ends. And you walk back out through those doors and you go home to a country where your neighbor might be reporting your associations to someone you'll never meet. That is not a metaphor. That was the specific texture of daily life in Stalin's USSR in 1935. And here is the detail that makes the whole evening genuinely uncomfortable to think about. Stalin himself was not there. The most powerful man in the country, the man whose decisions shaped every aspect of Soviet life, was conspicuously absent from the party. Which means that somewhere, that night, while 400 or 500 of Moscow's most powerful people were drinking champagne inside an American diplomat's fantasy ballroom, Stalin was elsewhere. Watching. Not watching the party, necessarily, but watching everything, always, in the way that people with that kind of power tend to do. His absence from the room didn't mean his absence from the equation. It just meant nobody could see exactly where he was in it. And then comes the part that history books tend to bury in a footnote, but which is really the whole point of this story. Some of the people who celebrated inside Spaso House that night, powerful, celebrated, seemingly untouchable, did not survive the decade. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 consumed members of exactly the elite that filled Bullitt's ballroom. Military commanders were arrested. Government officials were tried. People who had every reason to believe that their proximity to power protected them discovered, sometimes very suddenly, that proximity to power in Stalin's USSR was not a shield. It was a target. This is the part that doesn't fit neatly into a textbook, because it forces you to hold two things at once. A room full of flowers and music and a bear drinking champagne, and the knowledge that some of the people in that room were already living on borrowed time without knowing it. The Spring Festival wasn't Stalin's party. It was an American diplomat's attempt to build something beautiful inside a very dark place. What it accidentally became was something more unsettling. A snapshot of a single night where luxury and doom shared the same address, and nobody inside the ballroom could tell which side of that line they were standing on. Subscribe if history's strangest nights are your thing, and watch this one next.